You're walking down the street and you notice a blue Volkswagen Beetle. Nothing special, just a car. But then, over the next few days, you see blue beetles everywhere. Parked outside your office, 3 of them on your commute, 1 in a commercial you're barely watching. It feels impossible. It feels like the universe is trying to tell you something, or like you've stumbled into some glitch in the matrix where blue beetles have suddenly multiplied across your city. Except they haven't. The number of blue Volkswagen Beetles in your area hasn't changed. What changed was you. Something in your brain flipped a switch the moment you noticed that first one, and now you're caught in what psychologists call a frequency illusion. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, the experience of suddenly seeing something everywhere once you've noticed it once. The name itself has a strange origin. In 1994, a man named Terry Mullen wrote a letter to a Minnesota newspaper's online forum, describing exactly this experience. He'd recently learned about the Baader-Meinhof group, a German terrorist organization from the 1970s, and suddenly he was encountering references to them everywhere he looked. He needed a name for this weird feeling, so he called it the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. The term stuck, even though it has nothing to do with German terrorists and everything to do with how your brain decides what counts as worth noticing. The core mechanism is disarmingly simple. Your brain is not actually perceiving everything in your environment. That would be impossible. At any given moment, millions of sensory inputs are available. The hum of electricity in the walls, the texture of your clothes against your skin, the precise shape of every shadow in your peripheral vision, the faint smell of whatever detergent is on the shirt of the person walking past you. Your brain can't process all of it, so it filters, aggressively. It selects a tiny fraction of available information and promotes that to conscious awareness while suppressing everything else. Before you noticed that blue beetle, your brain had a filter in place that categorized blue beetles as irrelevant, background noise, visual static. They were there, probably in roughly the same numbers they are now, but your attentional system had no reason to highlight them. They didn't connect to your goals, your interests, your current concerns, or anything else your brain had marked as mattering. So they slipped past, unnoticed, unremembered. But the moment you noticed one, something shifted. Maybe a friend mentioned wanting to buy one. Maybe you read an article about them. Maybe you just happened to really look at one for the first time in years and thought about how charming they are. Whatever the trigger, your brain updated its filter. It created a new category. Blue Volkswagen Beetles are now relevant. And once something is marked as relevant, your attention system starts scanning for it. This isn't a conscious decision. You're not deliberately looking for blue beetles. You might not even remember the initial encounter that set the whole thing in motion. But your attentional filter has been reconfigured, and now, every time a blue beetle enters your sensory field, it gets flagged, prioritized, pushed into conscious awareness. Where before you might have seen a dozen of them without registering a single one, now you notice every single instance. This is selective attention, and it's one of the most fundamental features of how perception works. Your conscious experience of the world is not a camera recording everything in front of you. It's a highly curated highlight reel assembled by systems that are constantly making decisions about what matters. And those decisions are shaped by what you've recently encountered, what you care about, what you're afraid of, and what you're currently thinking about. The frequency illusion also draws power from a second mechanism working in parallel: confirmation bias. Once you've noticed that first blue beetle and started wondering if they're suddenly everywhere, you've formed a hypothesis. An unconscious one maybe, but a hypothesis nonetheless. And human brains are spectacularly bad at testing hypotheses fairly. We don't naturally seek out disconfirming evidence. We seek out confirming evidence. We notice things that support what we already suspect, and we fail to notice things that contradict it. So now, not only is your attentional system flagging blue beetles, but every time you see one, it feels like proof. Evidence that supports your growing sense that these cars are everywhere. You're not counting the times you don't see a blue beetle. You're not comparing the rate at which you see them now to some baseline rate from before you started noticing. You're just accumulating instances, and each instance feels significant. This creates a feedback loop. The more you notice blue beetles, the more convinced you become that they're common, which makes you more likely to keep noticing them, which strengthens the conviction. The illusion becomes self-reinforcing, and because you're not aware that your perception has been filtered and biased, the experience feels like an objective feature of reality. It genuinely seems like blue beetles have become more common. The frequency illusion doesn't require anything mystical or even particularly unusual about brain function. It's just what happens when normal attentional mechanisms encounter a world that contains repeated instances of something you've recently marked as relevant. But the subjective experience can be startling. It can feel uncanny, especially if you don't know the mechanism behind it. There's a meaningful distinction to draw here between frequency illusion and cases where something actually has become more common. Sometimes you start noticing something everywhere because it genuinely is everywhere. A new product launches and suddenly there are ads for it on every platform. A news event happens and suddenly everyone is talking about it. A meme takes off and saturates your social media feeds. In those cases, you're not experiencing an illusion. You're experiencing an actual change in the environment. The tricky part is that the subjective experience is nearly identical. Whether blue beetles have genuinely increased in number, or your brain has simply started noticing the ones that were always there, the phenomenology is the same. You see them everywhere. The feeling of sudden ubiquity is indistinguishable. And because most of us don't walk around with baseline statistics about how often we encounter various objects, we have no reliable way to tell the difference based on subjective experience alone. This is where the illusion gets its power. It feels real because, in a sense, it is real. You really are seeing more blue beetles, but you're seeing more of them because you're noticing more of them, not because there are more of them to see. The change is in you, not in the world. But from the inside, there's no clear signal that distinguishes between those two possibilities. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon shows up across every domain of experience. You learn a new word, and suddenly everyone seems to be using it. You discover a band, and suddenly you hear their songs in coffee shops and clothing stores. You read about a medical condition, and suddenly you know 3 people who have it. You think about an old friend, and they text you the next day. Each instance feels remarkable. Each instance seems to demand some kind of explanation beyond coincidence. But the explanation is usually mundane. Your brain changed what it was filtering for. The world stayed the same. You just started noticing a different slice of it. There are edge cases worth considering. Sometimes, the initial trigger that makes you notice something is itself, caused by an actual increase in prevalence. A disease becomes more common, which leads to more news coverage, which causes you to learn about it, which makes you start noticing cases you would have previously overlooked. In that scenario, there's both a real increase and a frequency illusion layered on top of it, amplifying your perception beyond what the data would support. Disentangling these effects requires looking at actual statistics rather than trusting your gut. The frequency illusion also interacts with memory in interesting ways. When you're in the grip of the phenomenon, you might start to remember previous encounters that you'd forgotten. You might recall that you actually saw a blue beetle last month and another one 3 months ago. These recovered memories feel like they're supporting the sense that the cars have always been common, but they're also evidence of how much you were previously not noticing. If those cars were always there, but you only remember them now, after your attention has been primed, that's the mechanism revealing itself. Human memory is not a neutral recording. It's a reconstructive process, and what you remember is heavily influenced by what you're currently attending to and thinking about. This is why eyewitness testimony is so unreliable, and why leading questions can implant false memories. Your current mental state shapes what you recall from the past. So when you're hyper-aware of blue beetles, you're more likely to remember past blue beetles, and those memories integrate seamlessly into the feeling that they've always been everywhere. The phenomenon doesn't require repetition over days or weeks. It can happen within a single conversation. You hear someone mention a concept you've never encountered before, and then, 20 minutes later, in the same discussion, someone else brings it up. The timing feels impossible. But if you're in an environment where people share overlapping knowledge bases, or where information spreads quickly through a social network, these coincidences are statistically unremarkable. Your brain just isn't equipped to intuitively grasp how often unlikely seeming things should happen by chance. One of the most persistent features of the frequency illusion is how resistant it is to intellectual awareness. You can know, consciously, that you're experiencing a cognitive bias. You can understand the mechanism. You can even explain it to someone else, and the feeling will persist. You'll still notice those blue beetles, and each sighting will still carry a little charge of significance. Knowing about the illusion doesn't make it go away. It just gives you a framework for interpreting the experience differently. This gap between intellectual understanding and subjective experience shows up throughout psychology. Optical illusions still look wrong even after you measure them and confirm that the lines are the same length. Cognitive illusions work the same way. The feeling is generated by processes that run below the level of conscious control, and conscious knowledge doesn't override them. You can choose how to interpret the feeling, but you can't choose whether to feel it. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon sits at the intersection of attention, memory, and probability. It reveals how much of what we think of as objective perception is actually a constructed experience shaped by internal priorities we're barely aware of. And it highlights a humbling fact about human cognition. We are not reliable narrators of our own experience. The things that feel most significant are often the things our brains have arbitrarily decided to spotlight. The patterns that feel most real are often the patterns we've been primed to see. And the world we think we're perceiving directly is actually a heavily edited version, filtered and shaped by mechanisms we don't control and often don't even notice. The filtering happens before you're aware anything is being filtered, long before that blue beetle registers as a thought in your consciousness. Before it becomes something you could name or point to, your brain has already made a decision. This thing, out of everything else in the environment, gets through. The structure responsible for that initial decision is a network of neurons sitting at the base of your brain, right where your spinal cord meets your skull. It's called the reticular activating system, and it's one of the reasons you're not constantly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information hitting your senses every second. The reticular activating system, often shortened to RAS, is not a single structure. It's a network of nuclei and pathways that spans from the medulla up through the pons and into the midbrain. Anatomically, It looks almost primitive compared to the elaborate folds of the cortex above it, but its job is essential. It receives input from nearly every sensory system in your body: vision, hearing, touch, pain, signals from your internal organs. All of that information passes through the RAS, and the RAS decides what gets escalated to higher brain regions for further processing. Think of it as a gatekeeper, not a passive one that just opens and closes a door, but an active one that's constantly evaluating incoming information against a set of criteria. Is this new? Is this important? Is this dangerous? Is this related to something the organism cares about right now? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, the information gets flagged and passed upward. If the answer is no, it gets suppressed, filtered out. You never become conscious of it. This filtering is not optional. Your brain does not have the capacity to process all available sensory data. If every photon hitting your retina, every vibration reaching your eardrums, every molecule brushing against your skin were promoted to conscious awareness, you would experience something closer to a seizure than to perception. The world would be an undifferentiated flood of sensation with no structure, no hierarchy, no meaning. The RAS prevents that. It reduces the incoming stream to something manageable. The criteria the RAS uses are not fixed. They shift based on context, based on learning, based on what's happened recently. This is where the connection to frequency illusion becomes clear. When you encounter something novel or personally relevant, the RAS updates its filters. It starts treating that category of information as worthy of attention. And because the RAS operates below the level of conscious awareness, you don't realize this update has happened. You just suddenly start noticing things you weren't noticing before. There's a classic demonstration of this that doesn't require any special equipment. If you're in a relatively quiet room right now, stop for a moment and listen. Really listen. Notice all the sounds that are present. The hum of a refrigerator or heating system, the rustle of air through vents, distant traffic, the creak of a building settling. These sounds were there the entire time you've been reading, but you weren't aware of them until you directed your attention toward them. The RAS was filtering them out as irrelevant background. The moment you decided to listen for them, the filter changed, and they appeared in your conscious experience. That's selective attention in real time, and it's happening constantly, not just with sound, but with every sensory channel. Your RAS is making thousands of these filtering decisions every second, and the vast majority of them never reach your awareness. You only notice the results, the edited version of reality that makes it through the gate. The reticular activating system also plays a critical role in regulating arousal and wakefulness. Damage to the RAS can result in coma or persistent vegetative states, because without it, the brain loses the ability to maintain the alert state necessary for consciousness. This makes sense when you consider what the RAS is doing. It's not just filtering sensory information. It's determining what's important enough to keep the organism awake and paying attention to. It's the system that decides whether right now is a time to be vigilant or a time to let awareness dim. This arousal function interacts with the filtering function in interesting ways. When you're highly aroused, anxious, or alert, your RAS becomes less selective. More information gets through. This is adaptive in threatening situations. If you're walking alone at night and you hear a sudden noise, you want your attention to broaden, to take in more of the environment so you can assess whether there's danger. Your RAS responds to that state of heightened arousal by opening the gates wider. You become more aware of sounds, movements, shadows, anything that might be relevant to survival. But this also means that your baseline state of arousal affects what you notice. Someone who is chronically anxious has an RAS that is calibrated differently than someone who feels safe most of the time. They will notice more potential threats, more ambiguous stimuli, more things that could be interpreted as dangerous. This isn't a choice. It's a difference in how the filtering system is tuned. And because the anxious person is noticing more threat-related information, they accumulate more evidence that the world is threatening, which reinforces the anxiety, which keeps the RAS tuned to a high sensitivity setting. Another feedback loop. The RAS doesn't work in isolation. It's deeply integrated with other brain systems, particularly the thalamus, which acts as a relay station for sensory information on its way to the cortex. The RAS modulates thalamic activity, effectively controlling how much sensory data gets passed along to higher processing regions. When the RAS flags something as important, it enhances thalamic transmission of that information. When it marks something as irrelevant, it suppresses thalamic activity, and the information never makes it to the cortex in a form that could become conscious. There are also descending pathways. The cortex can send signals back down to the RAS, essentially telling it what to look for. This is how voluntary attention works. If you decide to look for blue beetles, your prefrontal cortex sends a signal down to the RAS and thalamus, biasing them to prioritize visual information matching that description. The RAS then adjusts its filters accordingly, and suddenly you're noticing blue beetles. The same mechanism underlies the cocktail party effect, where you can pick out your name from a noisy conversation happening across the room. Your RAS is primed to flag that specific pattern of sounds as highly relevant, so it gets through even when most other speech is being filtered out. This bidirectional relationship between cortex and RAS means that attention is not purely bottom-up or purely top-down. It's both. The RAS filters based on what seems immediately salient or novel, and it also filters based on what higher brain regions have designated as currently important. The two processes interact and reinforce each other, creating a dynamic system that's constantly adjusting what counts as foreground versus background. When the reticular activating system malfunctions, the results can be severe. In conditions like ADHD, there's evidence of dysregulation in the networks that control attentional gating. The filter doesn't work properly. Too much information gets through, or the wrong information gets prioritized, or the system fails to sustain focus on relevant stimuli. The subjective experience is one of being overwhelmed by distractions, of having attention constantly pulled toward whatever is most immediately salient rather than what's most important for the task at hand. At the opposite extreme, damage to the RAS or related structures can result in neglect syndromes, where entire categories of information are filtered out so aggressively that the person becomes unaware of half their visual field or half their body. A patient with hemispatial neglect might eat food from only one side of their plate, not because they can't see the other side, but because their attentional system has stopped registering it as existing. The information reaches the eyes, but it never makes it through the gate. These clinical cases reveal how much of what we consider normal perception depends on the proper functioning of these gating mechanisms. The feeling of being a unified self, perceiving a coherent world, is only possible because the RAS is successfully filtering the chaos of raw sensation into a structured stream of relevant information. When that filtering breaks down, the subjective experience breaks down with it. The RAS is also involved in learning what to attend to. When you encounter something repeatedly, especially if it's paired with reward or punishment, the RAS adjusts its filters to prioritize that stimulus in the future. This is part of how habits form. You learn to automatically notice cues associated with habitual behaviors, and that noticing happens at a level below conscious deliberation. Your RAS has been trained to flag those cues, so they capture your attention before you've even decided whether to pay attention to them. This learning process is efficient, but it also means your attention gets shaped by your history in ways you might not endorse if you were aware of them. If you've spent years in an environment where certain kinds of information were important, your RAS will continue to prioritize that information even after you've moved to a new environment where it's no longer relevant. The filter is slow to update. It's sticky. This is why changing attentional habits is difficult. You're not just trying to change what you consciously decide to focus on. You're trying to retrain a system that operates largely outside conscious control. The reticular activating system is also responsive to novelty in a way that's separate from learned relevance. Novel stimuli, things that are unexpected or don't fit existing patterns, automatically capture attention. This makes evolutionary sense. Novelty could be a new threat or a new opportunity, and either way, it's worth investigating. The RAS is wired to flag the unfamiliar and push it into conscious awareness so higher brain regions can assess it. This novelty bias is part of why the frequency illusion feels so strange. The first time you notice the blue beetle, it registers as novel, at least in the sense that you're attending to it in a way you haven't before. The RAS flags it. That creates a memory trace, and now every subsequent blue beetle is no longer entirely novel, but it's connected to that recent memory trace, which makes it feel relevant. The RAS starts treating blue beetles as a category worth noticing, and the more you notice them, the more strongly that category gets reinforced in the attentional filter. There's no conspiracy. There's no increase in blue beetles. There's just a neural network at the base of your brain that updated its criteria for what counts as important, and now you're experiencing the consequences of that update as a change in the world rather than a change in your perception. The RAS keeps you sane by keeping you selectively blind, and the moment it decides you should see something, you see it everywhere. You walk into a room and someone says the word elephant, nothing more. Just the word, spoken once in passing. Then you sit down to read, and within the first paragraph, there's a reference to elephants. Odd. Later, you overhear a conversation behind you and someone mentions elephant memory. You start to wonder if you've entered some kind of elephant-themed dimension. But what's actually happened is much simpler and much stranger. The word elephant, spoken once, has temporarily reorganized part of your mental landscape. It's made certain thoughts easier to access, certain connections easier to make, and certain perceptions more likely to occur. This is priming, and it's one of the quieter mechanisms behind why you keep seeing the same things everywhere. Priming is a form of implicit memory. It doesn't feel like remembering. You're not consciously recalling the moment someone said elephant. You might have already forgotten it happened at all. But the exposure has changed the state of your cognitive system in a measurable way. Concepts related to elephants, words associated with elephants, memories involving elephants, they've all become more accessible. They're sitting closer to the surface of your mind, ready to be activated with less effort than they would have required an hour ago. The classic demonstration of priming comes from word recognition studies. Researchers flash a word on a screen for a fraction of a second, too fast for conscious awareness. Then they ask participants to complete word fragments or to identify words presented briefly. People who were primed with a word like doctor are faster to recognize the word nurse than people who weren't primed. They're faster to complete the fragment NUR with nurse rather than numb or null. The initial exposure to doctor has activated a network of semantically related concepts, and nurse sits within that network. The activation spreads, making everything connected to doctor temporarily easier to access. This spreading activation is not random. Your memory is not organized like a filing cabinet with discrete folders. It's organized more like a web, with nodes representing concepts and connections, representing associations. When one node is activated, that activation spreads along the connections to neighboring nodes. The strength of the spread depends on the strength of the association. Doctor and nurse are strongly associated, so activating one makes the other highly accessible. Doctor and elephant are weakly associated, so activating one has minimal effect on the other. The structure of this semantic network is built through experience. You've encountered doctors and nurses together countless times, in language, in media, in real life. Every co-occurrence strengthens the connection between those concepts in your mental network. So when doctor gets activated, the pattern of spreading activation reflects the statistical structure of your experience. The things that tend to appear together in the world tend to be connected in your mind. Priming doesn't just affect word recognition. It affects perception, judgment, behavior, and emotional response. If you're primed with words related to old age, you walk more slowly down the hallway afterward. If you're primed with words related to rudeness, you're more likely to interrupt someone in the next interaction. If you're primed with images of money, you become less helpful and more self-reliant. These effects happen without conscious awareness and often without conscious intent. The priming changes the accessibility of certain mental content, and that change in accessibility influences what you think, feel, and do next. This is where priming connects to the frequency illusion. When you notice something for the first time, or when something becomes salient for any reason, you've primed yourself. You've activated a node in your semantic network. And now, all the concepts connected to that node are more accessible. If you read an article about Volkswagen Beetles, you've primed not just the specific concept of that car, but also related concepts. German engineering, vintage design, compact cars, maybe even specific memories of seeing Beetles in the past. All of that associated content is now sitting closer to the surface. This increased accessibility means you're more likely to notice Beetles when you encounter them. The perceptual system doesn't have to work as hard to categorize the object. The match between the sensory input and the activated mental representation happens faster and more easily. And because it happens faster, it's more likely to capture attention before something else does. You're in a race for conscious awareness between thousands of potential objects in your environment, and the primed object has a head start. Priming also affects interpretation. Imagine you see a car in the distance. It's blue. It's small. From this distance, you can't make out the exact model. If you've been primed with beetle-related content, you're more likely to interpret that ambiguous stimulus as a beetle than you would be otherwise. The activated representation biases your perceptual system toward that interpretation. You might walk closer and discover it's actually a Mini Cooper or a Fiat, but the initial guess was shaped by what was already active in your mind. This interpretive bias is subtle but powerful. Most of the time, you're not perceiving objects that are perfectly clear and unambiguous. You're perceiving partial information and filling in the gaps based on expectation and context. Priming shapes those expectations. It changes what your perceptual system predicts it's going to see, and those predictions influence what you actually experience. This is part of why eyewitness testimony is unreliable. If a witness has been exposed to suggestive information before recalling an event, that information primes certain interpretations, and those interpretations can feel like genuine memories. The duration of priming effects varies depending on the type of priming and the strength of the initial exposure. Perceptual priming, where you're faster to identify a stimulus you've seen recently, can last for hours or even days. Semantic priming, where related concepts become more accessible, tends to decay more quickly, often within minutes. But repeated priming can create longer-lasting effects. If you encounter the same concept multiple times over several days, the cumulative priming can keep that concept highly accessible for an extended period. This is part of why the frequency illusion is self-sustaining. The first time you notice a blue beetle, you prime yourself. That makes you more likely to notice the next one. Noticing the second one primes you again, reinforcing the effect. Each subsequent encounter adds another layer of priming, keeping the concept active and accessible. The effect doesn't decay because it keeps getting refreshed. You're stuck in a loop where noticing leads to more noticing. Priming interacts with attention in both directions. Primed content is more likely to capture attention, but attending to something also primes it. This creates a bi-directional relationship where what you've recently thought about influences what you notice, and what you notice influences what you think about next. The boundary between the two processes is blurry. They're different aspects of the same underlying dynamic, the continuous updating of which mental representations are currently active and accessible. There's also negative priming, which is less intuitive. If you're instructed to ignore a particular stimulus, that stimulus can actually become less accessible afterward. You're slower to recognize it, slower to recall it, slower to respond to it. This happens because ignoring something requires active suppression, and that suppression lingers after the initial task is over. The representation gets tagged as irrelevant, and the cognitive system treats it accordingly. Negative priming is weaker and less consistent than positive priming, but it demonstrates that accessibility can be decreased as well as increased. Priming effects are strongest when the primed content is relevant to the current task or context. If you're primed with the word bread and then asked to name a breakfast food, the priming will have a strong effect. If you're primed with bread and then asked to solve a math problem, the effect will be minimal. The cognitive system is not indiscriminately making everything associated with bread more accessible. It's making bread-related content more accessible in ways that are potentially useful given what you're currently doing. The system is trying to be efficient, to pre-activate information that might be needed soon. This context sensitivity means that priming doesn't make you a passive receiver of whatever you've recently been exposed to. The effects are modulatable by intention, task demands, and conscious strategy. If you're aware you've been primed and you actively try to counteract it, you can reduce the effect, though you probably can't eliminate it entirely. The initial boost in accessibility happens automatically, but what you do with that boost is partly under your control. Priming also operates across sensory modalities. You can be primed with a word and then be faster to recognize a related image. You can be primed with a sound and be faster to recall a related smell. The semantic network doesn't care how the information originally entered your system. Once a concept is activated, the activation spreads to all associated concepts, regardless of the sensory modality they're connected to. This cross-modal priming is part of why the frequency illusion can feel so pervasive. You read about something, and then you hear about it, and then you see it, and each encounter primes you for the next one across different channels. The implicit nature of priming is critical to its power. If you had to consciously remember every recent exposure in order to benefit from it, the system would be far less efficient. Priming allows your cognitive system to use recent experience to shape current processing without requiring conscious recall. You don't have to think about the fact that you heard the word elephant earlier. The system just works faster and more efficiently on elephant-related tasks because the prior exposure left a trace. But this implicit operation also means you're often unaware of why certain things feel easier or more salient. You don't notice that your interpretation of an ambiguous stimulus was biased by something you encountered an hour ago. You don't realize that your judgment was influenced by a word you saw subliminally. The priming is invisible, but the effects are real. Your experience is being shaped by recent history in ways you can't directly observe. This is part of what makes the frequency illusion so convincing. You don't remember priming yourself by noticing the first blue beetle. You don't. Feel the increased accessibility of beetle-related concepts. You just notice that you're seeing beetles everywhere, and because you're not aware of the mechanism, the pattern feels like it must be external. It feels like the world has changed rather than like your mental representation of the world has become more sensitive to a particular category of information. Priming reveals that your mind is not a blank slate waiting neutrally for input. It's a dynamic system where what just happened shapes what happens next, where recent experience leaves invisible traces that alter perception, memory, and action. Every thought you have, every word you read, every object you see changes the landscape of what comes easily to mind in the moments that follow. And most of the time, you have no idea it's happening. Your ancestors lived in a world where failing to notice a pattern could mean death. The rustle in the grass that signaled a predator. The subtle discoloration on food that meant poison. The shift in another person's expression that preceded violence. Evolution didn't reward the humans who were cautious and methodical about pattern detection. It rewarded the ones who saw patterns fast, who erred on the side of assuming connection and causation even when the evidence was thin. The cost of a false positive, seeing a threat that wasn't there, was usually just wasted energy. The cost of a false negative, missing a threat that was there, was often death. So your brain is not a neutral pattern detector, it's a biased one. It's built to find patterns even in noise, to see connections even in randomness, to detect signals even when what it's looking at is mostly static. This bias served your ancestors well. It kept them alive long enough to reproduce. But it also means that you, living in a world where most rustles in the grass are just wind, are stuck with a pattern detection system that's overly sensitive. You see faces in clouds. You hear messages in static. You find meaning in coincidence. And you notice patterns of repetition that don't actually exist. The neural architecture underlying pattern recognition is distributed across multiple brain regions, but certain areas play particularly critical roles. The fusiform gyrus, located on the underside of the temporal lobe, is heavily involved in recognizing complex patterns, especially faces and other objects that require fine-grained visual discrimination. This region becomes active when you identify a letter, a word, a face, a car, anything that requires matching incoming sensory data against stored templates. But the fusiform gyrus doesn't work alone. It's part of a broader network that includes regions in the parietal cortex, which handle spatial relationships and patterns in the environment, and regions in the prefrontal cortex, which handle abstract patterns and rules. Together, these areas allow you to detect patterns at multiple levels of abstraction. Not just visual patterns like the shape of a beetle, but also temporal patterns like the rhythm of speech, statistical patterns like the frequency of words, and conceptual patterns like the relationship between ideas. This multi-level pattern recognition is extraordinarily powerful. It's what allows you to read, to understand language, to navigate complex social situations, to learn skills. But the same mechanisms that allow you to detect real patterns also generate false patterns. The system is noisy. It produces output even when the input is random. And because you experience that output as perception rather than as inference, you don't naturally question whether the pattern is real or generated. One of the most studied examples of this is pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous stimuli. Seeing a face in the pattern of tiles on a bathroom floor, seeing a shape in the clouds, hearing words in the hum of a machine. These aren't hallucinations in the clinical sense. You're not seeing things that aren't there. You're seeing patterns imposed on things that are there, patterns that exist in your perceptual system rather than in the stimulus itself. Pareidolia is particularly strong for faces. Humans are so tuned to detect faces that the merest suggestion of two eyes and a mouth is enough to trigger face perception. This makes sense evolutionarily. Rapidly identifying faces and rapidly reading expressions on those faces was critical for social survival. But the cost is that you see faces everywhere, in electrical outlets, in the front grills of cars, in the arrangement of windows on buildings. The face detection system has a hair trigger, and it fires on minimal evidence. The same principle applies to other kinds of patterns. Your auditory system is biased to detect speech patterns, which is why you can hear words in white noise or in the sound of running water if you listen long enough. Your cognitive system is biased to detect causal patterns, which is why you assume that events that occur close together in time must be causally related. These biases are useful when the patterns are real. They become liabilities when you're trying to evaluate whether a pattern exists or whether you're just experiencing the output of an overactive detection system. The detection of patterns in sequences is especially prone to error. Humans are remarkably bad at recognizing randomness. If you flip a coin 100 times and record the results, the sequence will contain streaks, runs of heads or runs of tails that seem too consistent to be chance. But those streaks are exactly what you should expect from a random process. True randomness doesn't look evenly distributed at small scales. It looks clumpy. It looks patterned. And when you encounter those clumps, your pattern detection system flags them as meaningful. This is part of why the frequency illusion is so compelling. You notice a blue beetle once, twice, 3 times in a week. That feels like a pattern. It feels like too much to be coincidence. But if there are thousands of cars you encounter every week and dozens of different features you could potentially notice, the probability of seeing some specific feature multiple times by chance alone is actually quite high. You're just not intuitively equipped to calculate that probability. Your pattern detector sees 3 beetles and says, pattern, and you don't have a good cognitive tool for overriding that judgment. The brain's pattern detection system is also sensitive to emotional salience. Patterns that involve emotionally charged information are detected more readily and remembered more strongly. If you're afraid of spiders, you will detect spider-like patterns in shadows and textures far more often than someone who isn't afraid of spiders. The emotional weight of the stimulus lowers the threshold for pattern detection. You need less evidence to trigger the spider response. This is adaptive if spiders are actually dangerous in your environment. It's maladaptive if it leads you to see threats that aren't there. This emotional modulation connects pattern recognition to anxiety and paranoia. Someone who is highly anxious has a pattern detection system that's tuned to be hypervigilant. They see threats in ambiguous social cues. They detect hostile intent in neutral statements. They notice patterns of danger that others might miss or dismiss. Some of those patterns might be real, but many of them are the product of a detection system that's been calibrated to minimize false negatives at the cost of increasing false positives. Better to be wrong about a threat 100 times than to miss a real one. In extreme cases, this can tip into clinical paranoia or into the kind of pattern detection seen in schizophrenia. People experiencing psychosis often report seeing connections everywhere, noticing patterns that reveal hidden meanings and secret communications. The pattern detection system has become so sensitive that it's finding patterns in noise, connections in randomness, and those perceived patterns feel absolutely real. They're generated by the same neural machinery that detects actual patterns, so there's no internal signal that distinguishes them from genuine insight. This exists on a spectrum. Everyone experiences some degree of false pattern detection. You notice a coincidence and feel like it means something. You see a sequence of events and infer causation when there might only be correlation. You detect a pattern in someone's behavior that might just be random variation. These are not symptoms of illness. They're normal outputs of a system that's biased toward finding patterns. It's only when the false positives become overwhelming, when they dominate perception and drive behavior in destructive ways, that it crosses into pathology. The pattern detection system is also subject to confirmation bias, which we've touched on before, but which deserves emphasis here. Once you've detected a pattern, you become more likely to notice evidence that confirms it and less likely to notice evidence that contradicts it. If you've decided that blue beetles are everywhere, you'll notice every beetle and forget about the hundreds of other cars you see that aren't beetles. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Each confirming instance strengthens your confidence that the pattern is real, even if the actual base rate hasn't changed. This is compounded by the fact that your memory for patterns is better than your memory for non-patterns. You remember the hits and forget the misses. You remember the times you thought of someone and they called, and you forget the many times you thought of someone and they didn't call, or the time someone called without you thinking of them first. The pattern detector flags the coincidences, and the memory system preferentially encodes them, creating a distorted record that makes patterns seem more frequent than they actually are. There's also a social dimension to pattern detection. Humans share patterns with each other. You tell someone about the weird coincidence of seeing blue beetles everywhere, and now they're primed to notice beetles too. If they see one, they might tell you, which reinforces your sense that the pattern is real. The pattern becomes socially validated. Multiple people are noticing the same thing, which feels like strong evidence that it's not just in your head. But what's actually happening is that you've exported your pattern detection bias to someone else, and their confirmations are reflecting your initial bias back to you. This social amplification of patterns is how conspiracy theories spread. Someone notices a pattern, something that seems too consistent to be chance. They share it. Others start looking for confirming evidence. They find it, because when you're looking for confirmation, you usually find something that can be interpreted as confirming. The group collectively reinforces the pattern, and the individual members take the group's consensus as evidence that the pattern is objectively real rather than collectively constructed. The evolutionary logic of pattern detection also explains why it's hard to turn off. You can't just decide to stop seeing patterns. The detection happens automatically, below the level of conscious control. You can learn to be skeptical of patterns, to demand more evidence before concluding that a pattern is real, to actively look for disconfirming evidence. But you can't prevent the initial detection. The rustle in the grass will always capture your attention. Your brain will always generate the hypothesis that there might be a predator, even if you're in a suburban park where the most dangerous animal is a squirrel. What you can control is what you do after the pattern is detected. Do you treat it as a certain truth or as a hypothesis that needs testing? Do you seek out disconfirming evidence or only confirming evidence? Do you consider alternative explanations or lock on to the first explanation that feels right? These are metacognitive skills, and they're learnable, but they require effort. They require overriding the intuitive sense that the pattern is real because it feels real. The pattern detection system in your brain is one of your most valuable cognitive tools. It's also one of the least reliable. It gives you insight and illusion in roughly equal measure, and it doesn't come with a built-in mechanism for telling you which is which. You're left to figure that out on your own, armed with a detection system that evolved to keep you alive in a dangerous world, not to keep you accurate in a safe one. Something happens to you that matters. Not in an abstract way, not in the way that everything technically matters, but in a way that lands emotionally. You receive bad news about your health. You fall in love. You lose someone. You get the job you've been hoping for. The event itself might last minutes, but the way your brain processes it ensures that it will echo for days or weeks or longer. This is the work of emotional tagging, and it's one of the reasons certain things seem to follow you everywhere while others vanish from memory almost immediately. The brain has a problem. It encounters far more information than it can store in any durable way. If everything were encoded with equal strength, memory would be useless. You'd drown in irrelevant detail and struggle to retrieve anything important. So the brain needs a system for deciding what to remember strongly and what to let fade. Emotional significance is one of the primary signals it uses to make that decision. Information that arrives with emotional weight gets tagged, marked as important, and encoded more deeply than neutral information. This tagging process involves a structure called the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped cluster of nuclei buried deep in the temporal lobe. The amygdala is heavily involved in processing emotions, particularly fear and threat, but also reward, novelty, and social significance. When you encounter something emotionally salient, the amygdala activates. That activation sends signals to the hippocampus, the brain region most critical for forming new memories. The signal essentially says, "This matters, encode it strongly." The hippocampus responds by consolidating the memory more robustly. The synaptic connections that represent the experience are strengthened. The memory becomes more resistant to decay, more likely to be retrieved later, more likely to be integrated into your long-term understanding of the world. This is why you remember where you were when you heard about a major disaster, or when you experienced a personal crisis, but you don't remember where you were on an ordinary Tuesday 3 weeks ago. The emotional weight determines the encoding strength. But the amygdala doesn't just affect memory, it also modulates attention. When something emotionally significant appears in your environment, the amygdala sends signals to attentional networks, effectively saying, "Pay attention to this." Those signals enhance the processing of the emotional stimulus, making it more likely to be noticed, more likely to be perceived clearly, more likely to dominate your conscious awareness. Emotional salience hijacks attention. It pulls your focus toward the thing that matters, often at the expense of everything else. This attentional bias is automatic. You don't decide to pay more attention to emotionally charged information. It captures your attention before you've made any conscious decision. If you're scrolling through text and an emotionally loaded word appears, your eyes will pause on it longer than on neutral words. If you're scanning a crowd and you see an angry face, you'll fixate on it more quickly than on neutral or happy faces. The emotional content creates a gravitational pull on your attention. This is where emotional tagging connects to the frequency illusion. If something becomes emotionally significant to you, your brain tags it. And once it's tagged, two things happen. First, you're more likely to notice it when it appears again, because the amygdala has primed your attentional system to treat it as important. Second, when you do notice it, the experience is encoded more strongly, making you more likely to remember it. Both mechanisms amplify your sense that the thing is appearing frequently. Imagine you're worried about a health issue. Maybe you've noticed an unusual symptom and you're waiting for test results. That symptom is now emotionally tagged. It matters. It's scary. Your amygdala has flagged it as significant. Now, every time you encounter information related to that symptom, anything that could be interpreted as connected to it, your attention locks on to it. You see an article headline about the condition. You overhear someone mentioning it. You notice a commercial for a medication. Each instance feels striking, feels meaningful, because your brain is processing it with heightened emotional weight. And because each instance is being encoded strongly, you remember all of them. When you try to assess how often you've encountered this information, your memory gives you a biased sample. It gives you every emotionally charged encounter, encoded in vivid detail, while the countless neutral topics you encountered in the same period have faded into background noise. Your subjective sense of frequency is being distorted by the fact that emotional content is both more likely to be noticed and more likely to be remembered. The interaction between the amygdala and hippocampus also affects how memories are consolidated over time. Emotional memories don't just get encoded more strongly in the moment. They also get preferentially consolidated during sleep. While you sleep, your brain replays recent experiences, transferring them from the hippocampus to the cortex for long-term storage. Emotional memories are replayed more often and more intensely than neutral memories. This means that emotional content becomes even more deeply entrenched over time, while neutral content fades. This process can create a distorted narrative of your own experience. If you're going through a difficult period, the negative events and negative information you encounter will be tagged emotionally, encoded strongly, consolidated robustly, and recalled easily. When you later try to remember what that period was like, your memory will be dominated by the negative content, even if neutral or positive things were statistically more common. Your brain has created a highlight reel of emotionally significant moments, and that reel feels like an accurate summary of the experience. The same mechanism works in reverse with positive emotions. If you're excited about something, if you're in love or pursuing a new passion, your brain tags information related to that interest. You notice it everywhere. You remember every instance. You feel like the universe is conspiring to show you relevant information, when really, your amygdala has just reprioritized your attentional filters. There's also a social component. Emotional information is more likely to be shared. If you notice something that scares you or excites you, you're more likely to tell someone about it. And when you articulate it, you encode it even more strongly. The act of putting the experience into words and sharing it socially reinforces the memory and amplifies the sense that the thing is significant and frequent. You've now rehearsed it, which means you'll remember it even more vividly, which means it will feel even more present in your experience. Emotional tagging is not uniform across all emotions. Negative emotions, particularly fear and anxiety, tend to produce stronger tagging effects than positive emotions. This is another evolutionary legacy. Missing a reward is unfortunate. Missing a threat is fatal. So the system is calibrated to be especially sensitive to negative information. You will notice potential dangers more readily than potential opportunities. You will remember frightening experiences more vividly than pleasant ones. This negativity bias shapes perception and memory in ways that can distort your assessment of how common various things are. This bias is visible in how people assess risk. Events that are emotionally vivid, like plane crashes or terrorist attacks, are remembered more strongly and therefore feel more common than they actually are. Meanwhile, more statistically likely dangers that lack emotional punch, like car accidents or heart disease, don't receive the same attentional weight. The emotional tagging creates a mismatch between perceived frequency and actual frequency. The amygdala is also involved in detecting unexpected or novel stimuli, and novelty has its own emotional weight. When something violates your expectations, when it's surprising or unusual, the amygdala responds. This is separate from whether the thing is good or bad. It's the violation of prediction that triggers the emotional response. And once triggered, that response enhances encoding and attention. This is why surprising coincidences feel so meaningful. The novelty itself creates emotional weight, which creates strong encoding, which creates a vivid memory, which contributes to the sense that something strange and significant is happening. Emotional tagging can also be conditioned. If you have a bad experience associated with a particular stimulus, that stimulus becomes emotionally tagged even if it's intrinsically neutral. If you get food poisoning from a specific restaurant, the name of that restaurant will now trigger an emotional response. You'll notice it when you drive past. You'll remember the experience vividly when someone mentions it. The emotional tag has been attached through association, and it modulates your attention and memory accordingly. In cases of trauma, emotional tagging can become pathological. A traumatic event creates such strong emotional encoding that anything remotely associated with it becomes tagged. This is part of what happens in PTSD. The survivor's amygdala has become hypersensitive to trauma-related cues. Those cues capture attention involuntarily. They trigger intense emotional responses. They dominate conscious awareness. The person feels like they're constantly encountering reminders of the trauma. And in a sense they are, because their attentional system has been recalibrated to detect those reminders in stimuli that others would perceive as neutral. But even in non-traumatic contexts, emotional tagging shapes your experience in profound ways. It determines what you notice. It determines what you remember. It determines what feels significant and what fades into the background. And because the process is largely automatic, because it happens before conscious awareness, you don't realize how much your perception of frequency and pattern is being shaped by emotional weight rather than by objective occurrence. When you feel like you're seeing something everywhere, ask yourself, does this thing matter to me emotionally? Am I afraid of it? Excited by it? Worried about it? Hoping for it? If the answer is yes, there's a decent chance your amygdala has tagged it, your attention has been biased toward it, and your memory is giving you a distorted sample. The pattern you're seeing might be real, but it also might be the predictable output of a brain that's been evolutionarily tuned to make emotionally significant information impossible to ignore. You believe something. Maybe you've believed it for years. Maybe you just started believing it yesterday. Either way, your brain is now in the business of defending that belief. Not because you're dishonest or irrational, but because that's how belief works at a cognitive level. Once you hold a proposition to be true, your attention, your memory, and your reasoning all shift to support it. You become a biased evidence gatherer, and you don't even notice it's happening. This is confirmation bias, and it's one of the most well-documented and robust findings in cognitive psychology. It refers to the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms what you already believe. It's not that you ignore disconfirming evidence entirely. It's that confirming evidence feels more compelling, more relevant, more trustworthy. It gets weighted more heavily in your assessment. Disconfirming evidence, meanwhile, gets scrutinized more harshly, dismissed more readily, or simply forgotten. The mechanism operates at multiple levels. It starts with attention. If you believe something, you're more likely to notice information that supports that belief. Your attentional filters, shaped by the reticular activating system and modulated by goals and expectations, prioritize belief-consistent information. It passes through the gate more easily. It captures your awareness more reliably. You're not deliberately seeking it out, at least not always. It just shows up more prominently in your conscious experience. Then comes interpretation. Most information is ambiguous. It can be read multiple ways depending on the framework you bring to it. Confirmation bias shapes which framework you apply. If you believe that a particular political party is corrupt, and you encounter a news story about a politician from that party, you'll interpret ambiguous details as evidence of corruption. If you believe the party is virtuous, the same. Details will be interpreted as evidence of unfair attacks or honest mistakes. The raw information is the same. The interpretation is driven by the prior belief. Memory adds another layer. You remember belief-consistent information more easily and more vividly than belief-inconsistent information. When you try to recall what you know about a topic, your memory serves up examples that support your current view. This isn't always intentional distortion. It's a byproduct of how memory encoding works. Information that fits with your existing schemas gets integrated more smoothly. It has more connections to existing knowledge, which makes it easier to retrieve. Disconfirming information is encoded more weakly because it conflicts with the framework, and weak encoding means it's more likely to be forgotten. This creates a feedback loop. You believe something, so you notice confirming evidence, so you encode it strongly, so you remember it easily. So when you evaluate the belief later, your memory tells you that the evidence overwhelmingly supports it. The belief gets stronger. The bias gets stronger. The loop continues. Confirmation bias is especially powerful when it comes to frequency judgments. If you believe blue beetles are everywhere, you will notice blue beetles. Each sighting will feel like evidence supporting your belief. You won't notice the absence of blue beetles. You won't count the number of other cars you see. You won't compare the current rate of beetle sightings to some baseline rate from before you formed the belief. You'll just accumulate instances, and each instance will confirm what you already think. The bias is not symmetric. Disconfirming evidence doesn't have the same impact as confirming evidence. If you believe beetles are everywhere and you go an entire day without seeing one, that single day won't shake your belief. You'll explain it away. Maybe you just didn't drive through the right area. Maybe it was a fluke. The absence of evidence doesn't register as strongly as the presence of evidence, because your cognitive system is set up to notice presence, not absence. You can't see the cars that aren't there. Confirmation bias also affects how you test hypotheses. In principle, when you have a belief, you should look for evidence that could prove you wrong. If you believe all swans are white, you should go looking for black swans. Finding them would be informative. It would force you to revise your belief. But that's not what people naturally do. They look for more white swans. They seek confirming instances. Each white swan they find feels like it's supporting the belief, even though it's logically uninformative. 1,000 white swans don't prove that all swans are white. One black swan proves they're not. This asymmetry in hypothesis testing shows up across domains. If you believe a person is trustworthy, you'll pay attention to instances where they behave in trustworthy ways. You'll discount or explain away instances where they don't. If you believe a treatment works, you'll notice the times it seems to help and forget the times it doesn't. If you believe you're good at predicting the future, you'll remember your hits and forget your misses. The bias stacks the deck in favor of whatever you already think is true. There's a neural basis for this. When you encounter information that aligns with your beliefs, it activates reward pathways in the brain. Confirming evidence feels good. It produces a small hit of dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and motivation. This creates a literal incentive to seek out and attend to belief-consistent information. You're not just passively biased, you're actively motivated at a neurochemical level to find evidence that you're right. Disconfirming evidence, by contrast, often activates regions associated with error detection and cognitive conflict. It feels uncomfortable. It creates a sense of tension or dissonance. The brain registers that something doesn't fit, and that mismatch is aversive. So there's a built-in motivation to avoid, dismiss, or reinterpret disconfirming evidence. Not because you're trying to be irrational, but because your brain is wired to minimize the discomfort of being wrong. This discomfort is especially acute when the belief is central to your identity or worldview. If you believe something trivial, like blue beetles are common, disconfirming evidence is easy to accept. It doesn't threaten anything important. But if you believe something that's tied to your sense of self, your group membership, your moral values, or your understanding of how the world works, disconfirming evidence is much harder to process. It's not just information, it's a threat. And the brain responds to threats by defending, not by updating. Confirmation bias interacts with motivated reasoning, which is a broader category of biases where your goals and desires shape your reasoning process. If you want something to be true, you'll reason your way toward that conclusion. You'll set a low bar for evidence that supports what you want, and a high bar for evidence that contradicts it. The reasoning feels rigorous from the inside. You feel like you're being logical, evaluating evidence carefully. But the process is biased from the start by what you want the answer to be. In the context of the frequency illusion, motivated reasoning might look like this. You've started noticing blue beetles, and that noticing has created a sense of mystery or meaning. Maybe it feels like a sign. Maybe it feels like evidence of some larger pattern in your life. You're motivated to believe that the pattern is real, because the alternative is boring. The alternative is that you're experiencing a mundane cognitive bias, so you seek out confirming evidence. You pay attention to beetles and ignore non-beetles. You interpret ambiguous car sightings as beetles when they might not be. You remember the hits and forget the misses, and the whole time you feel like you're being rational, like you're just following the evidence. The tricky thing about confirmation bias is that being aware of it doesn't make you immune to it. You can know that humans are biased, you can even know that you specifically are biased, and you'll still exhibit the bias in your reasoning. Awareness helps, but it doesn't fix the problem. The bias operates at a level below conscious deliberation. It's baked into how attention, memory, and interpretation work. You can't just turn it off. What you can do is implement strategies that counteract it. Actively seek disconfirming evidence. Force yourself to generate alternative explanations. Ask people who disagree with you why they disagree and actually listen to their reasons. Keep track of your predictions and check them against outcomes. These strategies require effort and discipline, and they're uncomfortable because you're deliberately exposing yourself to information that might prove you wrong. But they're the best tools we have for counteracting a bias that's otherwise nearly invisible. Confirmation bias also has a social dimension. When you're in a group of people who share your beliefs, the bias gets amplified. Everyone is selectively attending to confirming evidence. Everyone is interpreting ambiguity in belief-consistent ways. Everyone is sharing their confirming observations with each other. The group creates an echo chamber where the belief feels overwhelmingly supported because no one is bringing up the disconfirming evidence. Everyone is biased in the same direction, and the collective bias feels like consensus reality. This is how communities can become completely convinced of things that are false. It's not that everyone is lying or stupid, it's that everyone is operating under the same bias, and the bias is self-reinforcing within them. Group. The more people confirm each other's beliefs, the stronger those beliefs become, and the harder it is for any individual to step back and question whether the foundation was ever solid. Confirmation bias is also why anecdotes feel so compelling. A single, vivid story that confirms what you believe will weigh more heavily in your mind than 100 statistics that contradict it. The anecdote is concrete, memorable, emotionally engaging. The statistics are abstract, dry, easy to dismiss. Your brain is set up to prioritize narrative over base rates, and confirmation bias exploits that tendency. You'll remember the story, you'll forget the numbers, and your belief will be shaped accordingly. In the end, confirmation bias is not a flaw you can eliminate. It's a feature of how cognition works. Your brain is not built to be an unbiased, truth-seeking machine. It's built to navigate the world efficiently, and part of that efficiency involves maintaining stable beliefs rather than constantly re-evaluating everything from scratch. The cost of that efficiency is that once a belief is in place, it's hard to dislodge, even when the evidence says you should. When you feel certain that you're seeing something everywhere, ask yourself, am I looking for evidence that I'm right, or am I looking for evidence that could prove me wrong? If the answer is the former, there's a good chance you're caught in the loop. The pattern might be real, but it also might be a belief you're confirming to yourself, one sighting at a time. You flip a coin 10 times and it comes up heads 8 times. Something feels wrong. 8 out of 10 seems too lopsided. It seems like the coin must be unfair, or like you must have flipped it incorrectly, or like something unusual is happening. But 8 heads out of 10 flips occurs about 4% of the time with a fair coin. Not common, but not remotely impossible. It'll happen. Roughly once every 25 times you flip a coin 10 times in a row. Your intuition, though, tells you it's far less likely than that. Your intuition is miscalibrated. Humans are stunningly bad at statistical reasoning. Not because we're unintelligent, but because our cognitive systems weren't built to process probabilities and base rates accurately. They were built to make fast decisions with limited information in environments where the relevant patterns were simpler and more concrete. You needed to know whether the rustling sound meant predator or wind, not whether the probability of encountering a predator on any given day exceeded some threshold value. Statistical thinking is evolutionarily recent, culturally learned, and cognitively unnatural. Intuitive thinking is ancient, automatic, and often wrong when it comes to numbers. One of the most pervasive failures is base rate neglect. Base rates are the underlying frequencies of events in a population. If 1% of people have a particular disease, that's the base rate. If you're trying to assess whether a person has the disease based on some symptom or test result, you need to take that base rate into account. But people don't do this naturally. They focus on the specific evidence in front of them and ignore the prior probability. Here's a classic example. Imagine a rare disease that affects 1 in 1,000 people. There's a test for it that's 99% accurate. If someone tests positive, what's the probability they actually have the disease? Most people intuitively say 99% because the test is 99% accurate. But that's wrong. The actual probability is closer to 9%. The reason is base rates. Because the disease is so rare, most positive test results are false positives. There are so many healthy people being tested that even a 1% false positive rate generates more false positives than there are true positives. This is deeply counterintuitive. It feels like a 99% accurate test should give you 99% confidence in the result. But accuracy and predictive value are different things, and the difference depends on base rates. When people ignore base rates, they wildly overestimate how much specific evidence should shift their beliefs. They latch onto the salient information and let it dominate their judgment. Base rate neglect shows up constantly in everyday reasoning. If you hear that someone is shy and likes to read, and you're asked whether they're more likely to be a librarian or a farmer, you'll probably say librarian. But there are far more farmers than librarians. The base rate matters. Even if librarians are more likely to be shy readers, the sheer number of farmers means there are probably more shy farmer readers than there are shy librarian readers in absolute terms. Your intuition ignores this and focuses on the match between the description and the stereotype. This bias is part of what powers the frequency illusion. When you notice blue beetles 3 times in a week, you don't automatically think about how many cars you saw total that week, or what percentage of cars on the road are blue beetles, or how many times you'd expect to see one by chance. You focus on the 3 instances. They feel like a lot. They feel like more than coincidence, but without reference to the base rate, you have no way to assess whether 3 sightings is actually unusual. Another related failure is the representativeness heuristic. People judge the probability of something by how representative it seems of a category. If something matches your mental prototype of a category, you judge it as more likely to belong to that category, regardless of actual probabilities. This is why stereotypes are so persistent. If someone fits the stereotype, your brain says they're likely to be a member of that group, even when the base rates suggest otherwise. The representativeness heuristic also makes people expect randomness to look more evenly distributed than it actually is. If you flip a coin 6 times, the sequence H, T, H, T, H, T feels more random than H, 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 T, 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 even though both are equally likely. The first one matches your mental representation of what randomness should look like. The second one looks patterned. So when you encounter streaks or clusters in genuinely random data, you assume something non-random is happening. Your intuition can't accept that randomness produces clumps. This is directly relevant to noticing things repeatedly. If you see blue beetles on 3 consecutive days, that feels like a pattern. It doesn't feel random. But clustering is exactly what you should expect from random events. If beetle sightings are randomly distributed across time, there will be periods where they cluster and periods where they're sparse. The clustering doesn't indicate that the underlying rate has changed. It's just what random distributions look like at small scales. There's also the availability heuristic. People judge the frequency of something by how easily examples come to mind. If you can quickly recall multiple instances of something, you assume it's common. If you struggle to think of examples, you assume it's rare. This is often a reasonable shortcut. Common things are encountered more often, so they're encoded more strongly and retrieved more easily. But the heuristic breaks down when memory is biased by factors other than actual frequency. Emotional salience, as we've discussed, makes things easier to remember. So emotionally charged events feel more common than they are. Vivid events, unusual events, recent events, all of these are easier to recall, and that ease of recall gets misinterpreted as evidence of high frequency. When you're in the grip of a frequency illusion, you can easily recall multiple instances of the thing you're noticing. That ease of recall makes it feel common, even if it's not. The availability heuristic also explains why people overestimate the frequency of dramatic, rare events and underestimate the frequency of mundane, common ones. Plane crashes are vivid and heavily covered by media, so they're easy to recall, so people think they're more common than they are. Car accidents are less vivid and less dramatic, so even though they're far more common, they feel less frequent. The ease of recall is shaped by salience, not by actual probability. People are also bad at understanding regression to the mean. If something extreme happens, the next event is likely to be less extreme, simply because extreme values are rare, and random variation tends to push things back toward the average. But people interpret this regression as meaningful. If a student does unusually well on one test and then worse on the next, people assume something changed. Maybe the student got lazy or the material got harder, but it might just be regression to the mean. The first test was a statistical outlier, and the second test is closer to the student's actual average performance. This failure contributes to the frequency illusion because people don't expect fluctuations. If you happen to see a lot of blue beetles one week and then fewer the next week, you don't think random variation. You think something changed. Maybe the initial week was unusual, or maybe the second week is unusual. You don't intuitively grasp that both could be normal variation around some stable average. There's also the gambler's fallacy, the mistaken belief that past random events affect future probabilities. If you flip a coin and get 5 heads in a row, people often think tails is due. But each flip is independent. The coin has no memory. The probability of heads on the next flip is still 50%. The streak doesn't change that. Yet people feel like the universe should balance things out, like a run of one outcome makes the opposite outcome more likely. The inverse error is the hot hand fallacy, where people think that a streak indicates a higher probability of continuation. If a basketball player makes several shots in a row, people think they have a hot hand and are more likely to make the next one. For a long time, this was considered a pure fallacy. Recent research suggests there might be small streak effects in some contexts, but they're much smaller than people believe. Mostly, people are seeing patterns in noise and interpreting them as predictive when they're not. Both of these fallacies reflect a failure to understand independence and randomness. People expect the world to be more patterned and more predictable than it is. They underestimate how much random variation exists in everyday events. And when they encounter that variation, they construct narratives to explain it. The narratives feel satisfying and coherent, but they're often attributing causation to what's actually just statistical noise. All of these statistical intuition failures compound when you're trying to assess whether something has genuinely become more frequent or whether you're just noticing it more. You don't have access to accurate baseline data. You don't naturally calculate base rates. You don't account for the number of opportunities for the event to occur. You don't expect randomness to produce clusters. You don't recognize regression to the mean. You rely on ease of recall, which is biased by recency and emotion. And you interpret all of this through a narrative framework that assumes patterns have causes. The result is that you feel certain you're seeing blue beetles everywhere, and your certainty is based on a series of cognitive processes that are systematically miscalibrated for statistical reasoning. The certainty feels like it's grounded in evidence. It feels like you're just reporting what you've observed. But what you've observed has been filtered through attentional biases, encoded through emotional tagging, remembered through confirmation bias, and interpreted through statistical intuitions that are reliably wrong. The only real solution is to externalize your reasoning. Count things, write them down, calculate actual frequencies, compare them to baseline expectations. Use tools that compensate for your brain's weaknesses. Because left to its own devices, your intuition will confidently tell you that patterns exist when they don't, that frequencies have changed when they haven't, and that coincidences are meaningful when they're just the predictable output of randomness operating over enough trials. Your gut is a terrible statistician, and most of the time you're trusting your gut. You're lying in bed at 3 in the morning and you think about your childhood friend, the one you haven't spoken to in years. The memory arrives unbidden, a flash of their face, their voice, some moment you shared that your mind has decided to surface right now for no apparent reason. You think about them for maybe 30 seconds, then the thought passes and you drift towards sleep. The next afternoon your phone buzzes. It's them, a text message out of nowhere. "Hey, been thinking about you. How have you been?" Your heart skips. The coincidence feels impossible. You thought about them, and then they contacted you. The timing is too precise to be chance. It feels like evidence of something, a connection that transcends normal causation. Maybe telepathy, maybe fate, maybe some organizing principle in the universe that creates meaningful patterns, that links minds and events in ways science hasn't explained. Carl Jung called this synchronicity, the experience of two events that are causally unrelated but meaningfully connected. He believed these coincidences pointed to something deep about the structure of reality. Or maybe you're just experiencing a predictable cognitive illusion produced by selective attention, memory bias, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how probability works. The drive to find meaning in patterns is one of the most fundamental features of human cognition. We are meaning-making machines. We don't just perceive the world, we interpret it. We construct narratives that explain what we observe, and those narratives give structure to experience. This is adaptive. Understanding cause and effect, recognizing patterns, building models of how things work, these abilities let humans predict and manipulate the environment in ways that other animals can't. But the system is tuned to over-detect meaning rather than under-detect it, because missing a meaningful pattern is often more costly than seeing a few false ones. The result is that we see meaning everywhere. We see it in random events, in coincidences, in the arrangement of symbols, in the timing of unrelated occurrences. And we feel that meaning. It doesn't arrive as a hypothesis to be tested. It arrives as a conviction, as something self-evidently true. The experience of synchronicity is emotionally powerful precisely because it feels like direct perception of hidden order. Jung's concept of synchronicity was an attempt to explain these experiences without dismissing them as mere coincidence. He proposed that there are acausal connecting principles in the universe, moments where the inner psychological state of a person aligns with external events in ways that can't be explained by chance or causation. He saw this as evidence of a collective unconscious, of archetypal forces that operate outside the normal laws of physics. It was a poetic idea. It resonated with people's subjective experience, but it's almost certainly wrong. Modern psychology offers a simpler explanation. Apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. This is not a disorder. It's a normal output of the pattern detection systems we've been discussing. Your brain is constantly searching for connections, for correlations, for patterns that might be predictive or explanatory. Most of the time, the patterns it detects are real and useful. Sometimes, they're not. Apophenia is what happens when the detection system fires on noise. The coincidence with your friend is a perfect example. Think about how many people you know. How many of those people cross your mind on any given day? How often you think briefly about someone and then forget about it? how many of those people might, independently, think about contacting you on any given day. The number of opportunities for the coincidence, thinking about someone and then hearing from them, is actually quite large. Most of the time, the two events don't align. You think about someone and they don't contact you, or they contact you without you having thought about them recently. Those instances don't register as meaningful, so you don't encode them strongly and you don't remember them. But when the two events do align, when you think about someone and then they reach out, the coincidence is striking. It gets flagged as significant. It gets encoded with emotional weight. It gets remembered vividly. And because you remember the hits and forget the misses, your subjective assessment of how often this kind of thing happens is wildly inflated. You think it happens all the time, because every instance you can recall is an instance where it happened. The many instances where it didn't happen have vanished from memory. This is the same mechanism behind the frequency illusion, but applied to coincidences rather than repeated observations. You're selectively attending to and remembering the instances that fit the pattern. The instances that don't fit are invisible to you, not because they're not there, but because your cognitive system doesn't mark them as worth noticing or encoding. The feeling of meaning that accompanies these coincidences is real. You're not imagining it, but the feeling is generated internally. It's your brain's way of signaling that it's detected a pattern. The problem is that the signal doesn't distinguish between real patterns and false ones. Both feel equally meaningful from the inside. The neural systems that generate the feeling of significance don't have access to base rates or statistical analysis. They just fire when certain conditions are met. Conditions that include surprise, emotional salience, and the perception of connection. There's a spectrum here. At one end, you have normal pattern detection and the occasional experience of meaningful coincidence. Everyone operates here. At the other end, you have clinical apophenia, where the pattern detection system becomes so overactive that connections are seen everywhere, even in purely random stimuli. This is a feature of certain psychotic disorders, particularly schizophrenia. People experiencing psychosis often report that everything feels connected, that hidden messages are embedded in ordinary events, that coincidences are too frequent and too specific to be chance. The neuroscience suggests that this is related to dopamine dysregulation. Dopamine is involved in learning, motivation, and the detection of salient or novel stimuli. When dopamine signaling becomes dysregulated, the system that tags things as significant starts firing inappropriately. Everything feels important. Everything feels meaningful. The person is experiencing an extreme version of the same pattern detection processes that produce synchronicity in healthy individuals. The difference is one of degree, not kind. This doesn't mean that all experiences of meaning are pathological. It means that the feeling of meaning is a product of cognitive processes that exist on a continuum. Those processes are useful most of the time. They help you learn, navigate social situations, and make predictions. But they can misfire. And when they do, the result is a false sense of connection, a pattern perceived where none exists. Humans also have a narrative bias. We don't just detect patterns, we tell stories about them. And stories require characters, motivations, causes, and effects. When a coincidence occurs, the mind immediately begins constructing a narrative to explain it. Why did I think about my friend at the same moment they thought about me? The universe must be trying to tell me something. We're meant to reconnect. There's some deeper bond between us that transcends physical separation. These narratives feel true because they're coherent and emotionally satisfying. But coherence is not the same as accuracy. The human mind is so committed to narrative that it will construct explanations even for explicitly random events. In studies where people are shown sequences of random numbers or random coin flips, they generate elaborate theories about why the sequence looks the way it does. They see patterns in the randomness and invent causes for those patterns. When told the sequence is random, they often don't believe it. It doesn't feel random. It feels structured. And if it feels structured, there must be a structure to explain. This narrative drive is part of why conspiracy theories are so compelling. They take a collection of loosely related or entirely unrelated events and weave them into a coherent story with agents, motives, and a unifying explanation. The story feels more satisfying than these things happened independently and there's no deeper connection. The mind prefers the narrative, even when the narrative requires extraordinary assumptions, because the narrative offers meaning and the alternative offers only randomness. Synchronicity occupies a similar space. It's a narrative imposed on coincidence. It transforms random alignment into evidence of hidden order. And because the human mind craves order, because we're deeply uncomfortable with the idea that much of what happens to us is the result of chance, the synchronicity narrative is appealing. It makes the world feel less arbitrary. It makes our lives feel less random. But wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. And feeling like something is true doesn't make it true. The feeling of synchronicity is real. The mechanism producing that feeling is well understood. And the mechanism does not require anything beyond ordinary cognitive processes operating on ordinary probability. There are billions of people on the planet, each having thousands of thoughts per day, each interacting with dozens or hundreds of other people directly or indirectly. The number of opportunities for seemingly meaningful coincidences is astronomical. Given enough opportunities, even extremely unlikely coincidences will happen regularly. They have to. The improbable becomes inevitable at scale. What would actually be strange is if you never experienced striking coincidences. Their absence would require explanation. Their presence does not. This doesn't mean life is meaningless. It means the meaning is something you construct, not something you discover embedded in the coincidences. You can decide that reconnecting with your old friend is meaningful because the relationship matters to you, because you value the connection, because it enriches your life. That meaning is real and valid. It just doesn't require the universe to be orchestrating events. It doesn't require telepathy or fate or synchronicity. It only requires that you care, and that caring is enough. When you notice patterns that feel too perfect to be chance, you're probably experiencing the intersection of a hyperactive pattern detector, selective memory, poor statistical intuition, and a deep need for the world to make sense. That's not mysticism. That's just being human. And understanding the mechanism doesn't have to diminish the experience. It can, actually. Deepen it, because you're seeing your own mind at work, seeing how it builds meaning from chaos, and that process, that meaning-making capacity, is one of the most remarkable things about being conscious at all. You start noticing blue beetles everywhere. You mention it to a friend. They laugh and say they've noticed them too now that you bring it up. A few days later, you see an article online about the resurgence of interest in classic Volkswagen Beetles. The comments section is full of people saying they've been seeing them more often lately. You check social media, and there's a thread about it. Someone's made a joke about beetle season. The phenomenon is no longer just yours. It's shared. It's collective. And now you're wondering, maybe something actually is happening. Maybe there really are more blue beetles on the road. This is where the frequency illusion intersects with genuine changes in the world. Because sometimes things do become more common, not because you started noticing them, but because social and technological forces amplify them in ways that make the pattern real and not just perceptual. Separating the two, distinguishing between a cognitive illusion and an actual trend, becomes genuinely difficult, especially when the tools you're using to check are themselves subject to the same amplification effects. Start with social contagion. Attention spreads. When you tell someone about the thing you've been noticing, you prime them to notice it too. Their reticular activating system updates its filters. Blue beetles are now on their radar. If they see one, they might mention it back to you, which reinforces your sense that the pattern is real and widespread. You've effectively exported your frequency illusion to another person, and their confirmations loop back to strengthen yours. Neither of you realizes that the apparent increase in beetles is just two attentional systems that have been synchronized. This effect scales. If enough people start talking about blue beetles, if it becomes a meme or a joke or a topic of casual conversation, you've created a distributed network of people all primed to notice the same thing. Each person will see beetles and feel like the observation is independent confirmation of the trend. But it's not. It's a collection of biased observers all reinforcing each other's biases. The pattern is being constructed socially, not discovered in the environment. Now add algorithms. Social media platforms are not neutral conduits of information. They're designed to surface content that you're likely to engage with, and engagement is predicted partly by your recent behavior. If you click on an article about Volkswagen Beetles, the algorithm notes that. If you spend time looking at a post about beetles, the algorithm notes that too. And now, when the algorithm decides what to show you next, content related to beetles gets a boost. You're more likely to see articles, posts, ads, discussions about beetles, not because beetles have become more common in the world, but because the algorithm has inferred that beetles are relevant to you. This creates a feedback loop between your attention and the information environment. You notice beetles in the physical world, which primes you to click on beetle-related content online, which causes the algorithm to show you more beetle-related content, which keeps beetles salient in your mind, which makes you notice them more in the physical world. The cycle reinforces itself. And because the algorithm is doing this invisibly, you don't realize that your information diet has been skewed. It feels like beetles are suddenly everywhere online because they're everywhere in general, when actually they're everywhere online because the algorithm is catering to your demonstrated interest. The same mechanism applies to search. If you search for information about blue beetles, even once, that search gets recorded. It influences what autocomplete suggestions you see. It influences what ads get served to you. It might influence what results get prioritized in future searches. You're not seeing a neutral sample of the information landscape. You're seeing a version of the landscape that's been customized based on your previous behavior, customized in ways designed to keep you engaged, which usually means giving you more of what you've already shown interest in. This algorithmic amplification can create the appearance of a trend even when the underlying reality hasn't changed. If a few people start noticing and talking about blue beetles, that activity gets picked up by recommendation systems. More people see the content. Some of them engage with it. The engagement signals to the algorithm that this is popular content, so it gets amplified further. The visibility increases. More people become aware of the conversation. Some of them start noticing beetles themselves. They post about it. The algorithm amplifies that too. What started as a handful of people experiencing a cognitive bias becomes a widespread conversation that feels like it's responding to a real phenomenon. And here's the kicker. At a certain point, the conversation itself can create a real phenomenon. If enough people are talking about blue beetles, that might actually lead to increased sales of blue beetles, or increased media coverage, or increased visibility in car forums. The collective attention creates a feedback loop with reality. The thing that started as an illusion can bootstrap itself into something real, or at least something that has real social effects. This is not hypothetical. It happens constantly with fashion trends, viral memes, sudden interest in obscure topics. Someone notices something, they share it. The sharing spreads through networks and gets amplified by algorithms. The amplification makes the thing genuinely more visible. And the increased visibility validates the initial feeling that the thing was becoming more common. The perception and the reality become entangled in ways that are nearly impossible to disentangle from the inside. Distinguishing between a frequency illusion and a real trend requires external verification. You need data that's independent of your perception and independent of the social and algorithmic systems that might be amplifying the signal. If you want to know whether blue beetles have actually become more common, you need to look at vehicle registration data, or sales figures, or traffic studies that count and classify cars systematically. You can't rely on your memory, your social circle, your social media feed, or your search results. All of those are contaminated by the same biases and amplification effects. But most people don't do this. They rely on social proof. If other people are saying they're seeing the same thing, that feels like confirmation. If there's online discussion about it, that feels like evidence. The problem is that social proof is subject to all the same biases. 100 people can all be experiencing the same frequency illusion and reinforcing it in each other, and their collective agreement doesn't make it less of an illusion. It just makes it a shared illusion. There's also the issue of visibility versus prevalence. Algorithms don't just show you more of what exists, they change what's visible. Something can be rare in absolute terms, but highly visible if it's being algorithmically amplified. This creates a distorted sense of how common things are. If you're constantly seeing discussions about a rare event or a niche interest, it's easy to assume that event or interest is widespread, when actually you're just being shown a curated feed that overrepresents it relative to its actual frequency in the broader world. This visibility distortion affects perception of social and political issues, consumer trends, health concerns, everything. People think certain opinions are more common than they are because those opinions are amplified in their feeds. They think certain products are popular because those products are heavily advertised to them. They think certain risks are significant because those risks are discussed frequently in their information environment. The discussion frequency and the actual frequency are different things, but they're conflated in perception. The interaction between individual cognition and collective information systems is one of the defining features of modern life. Your brain is running the same pattern detection software it was running 10,000 years ago, but now it's operating in an environment where information is filtered, amplified, and personalized by algorithms. The result is that distinguishing between what's real and what's an artifact of how information is being served to you is genuinely hard. It requires metacognition, critical thinking, and access to data sources that aren't shaped by your previous behavior. When you feel like you're seeing something everywhere, the first question is, am I experiencing a frequency illusion? The second question is, are others experiencing the same illusion? And is that shared experience creating real social effects? The third question is, are algorithmic systems amplifying this, making it more visible than it would be otherwise? And the fourth question, the hardest one, is, how would I know? What evidence would I need to see to determine whether the pattern is perceptual, social, algorithmic, or genuinely reflective of a change in the underlying reality? Most of the time, you won't have access to that evidence. You'll be left with your subjective experience, the reports of people around you, and the information landscape you're embedded in, all of which are potentially biased in the same direction. The best you can do is hold your certainty lightly. Acknowledge that you might be seeing a pattern that isn't there. Acknowledge that even if others see it too, that doesn't make it real. Acknowledge that the tools you'd use to verify are themselves part of the system generating the illusion. And sometimes the pattern is real. Sometimes collective attention latches onto something that genuinely is changing, and the amplification is warranted. The difficulty is that from the inside, the real trends and the illusory ones feel identical. Both produce the same subjective sense of sudden ubiquity. Both generate social confirmation. Both get amplified by algorithms. The only difference is in the data, and the data is often not available, or not accessible, or not something you think to check. So you're left navigating a world where your perception is unreliable, social consensus is unreliable, and the information systems meant to inform you are actively shaping what you see based on what you've already looked at. It's not a conspiracy. It's just the emergent behavior of cognitive biases meeting algorithmic optimization. And the result is that you genuinely cannot trust your sense of what's common and what's not without external verification that most people never seek. You keep seeing blue beetles. Maybe they're everywhere. Maybe you just think they are. And maybe, because you think they are, you've made them everywhere in the only sense that matters. Everywhere in your world. You've been noticing blue beetles for weeks now. The pattern feels undeniable. You see them on your commute. You see them in parking lots. You see references to them online. The experience has weight. It feels significant. But somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a question forming. Is this real? How would I know? What would it take to determine whether I'm perceiving something genuine or manufacturing a pattern out of cognitive bias and selective attention? This is metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. It's the capacity to step outside your immediate experience and examine the processes that generated it. And it's one of the most powerful tools you have for distinguishing between reality and illusion. Because while you can't turn off confirmation bias or selective attention, you can learn to recognize when they're likely to be operating. You can develop a healthy skepticism toward your own certainty. You can implement strategies that test your perceptions against external standards. The first step is noticing the feeling itself. When you think you're seeing something everywhere, that feeling has a particular quality. It's a sense of sudden pattern emergence. Something that was background becomes foreground. Something invisible becomes hyper-visible. The shift happens quickly, often without a clear triggering event you can identify. And once it starts, it feels self-sustaining. Each new instance reinforces the pattern. Feeling grows stronger over time rather than fading. That phenomenology, that particular texture of experience, is a signal. Not a guarantee, but a signal that you might be experiencing a frequency illusion rather than detecting a genuine change in the environment. If you can recognize that signal, you can pause. You can ask whether there's reason to believe the pattern is real beyond your subjective sense that it is. You can interrogate your own certainty instead of just accepting it. The next step is considering alternative explanations. The human mind is good at generating explanations for patterns once it's detected them. You see blue beetles everywhere, and your mind immediately supplies a story. Maybe beetles are having a resurgence. Maybe there's a new marketing campaign. Maybe the weather has been nice and people are driving their vintage cars more. These explanations feel plausible. They fit the data. but they're generated after the pattern has been perceived, which means they're confirming rather than testing. The alternative explanation is simpler. Nothing in the world changed. You changed. You noticed a beetle. That noticing primed your attentional system, and now you're selectively perceiving and remembering instances that were always there. This explanation is less satisfying. It doesn't involve anything interesting happening in the external world. It's just your brain doing what brains do. But it's also more parsimonious. It requires fewer assumptions. It doesn't require any change in beetle prevalence or beetle marketing or beetle driving behavior. It only requires normal cognitive processes operating normally. When you have two explanations, one that requires something unusual to have happened in the world, and one that only requires ordinary cognitive bias, the cognitive bias explanation should be your default. Not because it's always right, but because cognitive biases are common and well documented, while genuine, sudden increases in the prevalence of specific things are relatively rare. You should start with the simpler explanation and only move to the more complex one if you have evidence that demands it. That evidence would need to be external to your perception. Ideally, it would be quantitative. If you want to know whether blue beetles have become more common, you need to count. How many cars do you pass on a typical commute? How many of those are beetles? What percentage? Can you compare that percentage to some baseline from before you started noticing the pattern? If you don't have baseline data, can you find external sources that do? Vehicle registration statistics, sales data, traffic surveys? Most of the time, you won't have this data. You won't have kept a count before the pattern started because you had no reason to. And external data sources might not exist or might not be easily accessible. So you're left with imperfect proxies. You can try to count going forward and see if the frequency matches your intuition. You can ask people who aren't primed to notice beetles whether they've noticed an increase. You can search for news articles or industry reports that might indicate a genuine trend. But even these proxies are problematic. If you start counting now, you're still operating with a biased attention system. You'll notice beetles more readily than other cars, which will inflate your count. If you ask other people, you prime them, and their subsequent reports will be contaminated by that priming. If you search online, you're feeding the algorithm more evidence that you're interested in beetles, which will skew what you see. Every method of checking is compromised by the same processes that created the illusion in the first place. This is the fundamental difficulty of reality testing from the inside. You can't step outside your own cognitive system. You can't perceive the world without filtering it through attention and memory and interpretation. So you're never comparing your perception to reality directly. You're comparing one perception to another perception, one measurement to another measurement, one biased sample to another biased sample. The best you can do is try to introduce independence, to find sources of information that weren't generated by the same biased processes. One useful heuristic is asking whether the pattern predicts anything. If blue beetles have genuinely become more common, that should have upstream and downstream effects. There should be a reason they became more common. There should be consequences of them being more common. If you can't identify plausible causes or effects, that's weak evidence that the pattern might not be real. It's not definitive. Sometimes things happen for reasons that aren't obvious, but it's a starting point. Another heuristic is considering how the pattern started. Can you identify a specific trigger? Did you read an article, have a conversation, see something that drew your attention to beetles initially? If you can identify a trigger, that suggests the pattern might be perceptual rather than environmental. The environmental frequency didn't change, your attentional focus did. If you can't identify a trigger, that's less informative. Sometimes things drift into awareness gradually without a discrete starting point. You can also test the stability of the pattern. Does it persist when you're deliberately not looking for it? If you consciously try to stop noticing beetles, do they still seem to appear frequently, or does the frequency drop? This is hard to do cleanly because the instruction to stop noticing them is itself a form of attention. You can't deliberately not think about something without thinking about it. But you can try shifting your attention elsewhere, focusing on something else, and seeing whether beetles still intrude into your awareness or whether they fade into the background. This persistence test is imperfect but informative. If the pattern persists even when you're not actively looking for it, that's some evidence it might be real. If it fades when you redirect your attention, that suggests it was driven by selective attention in the first place. Genuine environmental patterns tend to be relatively robust to shifts in what you're focusing on. Perceptual patterns are more fragile. They depend on the active maintenance of the attentional filter. Talking to others can help, but only if you're careful about how you do it. If you say, "Have you noticed a lot of blue beetles lately?" you've primed them. A better approach is to ask more general questions. "Have you noticed anything unusual about the cars on the road lately?" If they independently mention beetles, that's more informative than if you led them to it. Though even here, they might be picking up on cues from you, from the fact that you're asking at all, from your tone or expression. The fundamental problem is that reality testing requires unbiased data. And unbiased data is hard to come by when the processes generating the illusion are baked into how perception and memory work. You can't easily escape your own cognitive architecture. You can be aware of it. You can be skeptical of it. You can implement strategies that partially compensate for it. But you can't see the world as it is independent of how your brain constructs your experience of it. This might sound like it's leading to radical skepticism, to the idea that you can never know anything reliably. But that's not the conclusion. The conclusion is more modest. You can know things reliably, but reliability requires effort. It requires checking your intuitions against external standards. It requires seeking out disconfirming evidence. It requires quantifying when possible and being honest about uncertainty when it's not. It requires holding your beliefs lightly enough that you can revise them when the evidence shifts. The frequency illusion is not a catastrophic failure of perception. It's a predictable consequence of how attention and memory work in a world full of repeated patterns. The illusion becomes a problem when you mistake it for insight, when you treat your subjective sense of frequency as an accurate report of objective frequency, when you build conclusions on a foundation of biased perception without recognizing the bias. Metacognition is the antidote. Not a perfect one, but the best one available. It's the practice of noticing when your certainty might be unfounded, when your pattern detection might be firing on noise, when your memory might be giving you a highlight reel instead of a representative sample. It's asking the uncomfortable question, what if I'm wrong? What would that look like? How would I know? Most of the time, you won't definitively resolve the question. You'll be left with probabilities and provisional conclusions. Maybe there are more blue beetles. Maybe there aren't, and you can't say for sure without data you don't have access to. That's okay. Uncertainty is the appropriate response to insufficient evidence. It's more honest than false confidence, and it leaves you open to updating if better information becomes available. You keep seeing blue beetles everywhere. Maybe they're really there. Maybe they're not. And maybe the most important thing isn't figuring out which is true. Maybe it's learning to hold the question open, to sit with the uncertainty, to recognize the limits of what your subjective experience can tell you about the world outside your head. Because that recognition, that metacognitive awareness, is what allows you to navigate a reality that's far more ambiguous than it feels.